Howdy, all you delicious people. I am here today to review Alice in Borderland. So, reasonably going into this show, I'm ultimately immediately going to say, one, IMDb is not gonna be my best friend today. It's not. Reasonably, I guess, when looking at this, like half of the cast in IMDb has no images. Every time I look through somewhere else, it just tells you the actor's name and not what they are actually named in the show. So that's great. So that is giant donut holes worth of help. So reasonably, I'm gonna try to at some points maybe even have to forcibly describe people because I don't know the names of everyone. And plus, reasonably within this cast, people do tend to change a lot. Meaning, there seems to be a number of people added or subtracted or whatever throughout these even 4 episodes. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of rotation of things, and so reasonably, I would ultimately say do not invest in anybody, but invest in whatever this story is. So when going into this show, immediately what kind of came to me was that this show feels like an anime, which ultimately I believe it might be a manga or it might be it might have been an anime at sorts. It might be adapted from an anime. But anyways, I really enjoy this show. Ultimately, when looking at it, I can look at this and probably think of maybe the anime Darwin's Game, or ultimately probably the anime quasi ballparkingly Death Parade, or more so probably the anime Gantz. Uh, either the movie Gantz or the live action. The not the live action. The 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 movie or the anime. That ultimately is all of which you could probably see currently on an app called Nine Anime. So ultimately, if you at the end of the day haven't seen any anime lately, because ultimately there's a bunch of transitional apps you'd have to jump through hoops to. Currently, I'm watching Nine Anime. I guess is ultimately the app that I'm seeing for this week until whatever the heck happens to that. So going into this show, really, this show is reasonably about a game. It seems that at some point within this game, we have people that are quasi. Like, I would ultimately say that some of these people are quasi picked randomly, but it doesn't feel like it. It feels like there is a reason why all these people are chosen. I think some people might have a certain level of intelligence or might be able to know somebody that has a certain level of intelligence that ultimately can make or break them through this game. Ultimately, I think more than likely, if probably a lot of people play video games on here, that could probably queue a lot of people up to ultimately be at some point people that are chosen for this game. So now I'm gonna probably have to break down a little bit of this show ultimately. So I'm not gonna break it down in spoiler like terms. I'm gonna break it down as like teeing it up in case you don't know what this show is. Ultimately, I just went into the show because I saw it easily trending on Netflix, and so ultimately this is on Netflix. Normally I don't go into Netflix stuff, but I was just like, meh, like what is this interesting visual that I'm seeing? And so I ultimately saw an interesting visual, and I was like, okay, what is this show now? So reasonably, I went into it and I was like, wow, like this show reminds me of those animes that I just mentioned. Ultimately, Darwin's Game is my favorite anime. If you haven't seen Darwin's Game yet, try to find a way to find it because reasonably it's really good. It's, yeah, to me, honestly, really good. So when going into this, we don't have it to where every player has some special power of sorts. No. Recently, all of this stuff is really just trick and or mind game levels. Every single thing has some sort of reason for it being done the way it does. Here is the thing, though. One, we have it to where seemingly when we open this show up, the guys are otherwise talking about a zombie apocalypse and if they were to survive or not. You would think when going to every single one of these rounds, now that they eventually get to know what they are via later episodes, you would have thought that they would have came into every single round with something much more substantial every single time. But instead, they come every single time seemingly with nothing. I don't know how many numerous times every single person just comes in there with the shirt off of their back and that's all they come with. There are some people that probably have maybe a combat or technical or advantage of sorts. There's some people that can that are really good at puzzle working, which ultimately the main character is the main focal pointed character. Recently, I thought that there was some interesting times of which that the people would actually play together, and I thought that that was actually really smart, and I thought that that was a really cool idea. That if the group of people wins, everyone wins. It seems like they try to make it so, like they have it to where if a lot of people die at one point, they are still kind of setting up other people that eventually will be tied into a later on group. So ultimately, if you see your favorite character die, otherwise realize that there is another character probably coming in to swoop in to just be like, oh, I'm gonna help you, and I might be your love interest, maybe, possibly, probably not. But anyways, within the show, also we also have at points where seemingly people are sleeping their way to the top. Let's just say so. Recently, there are at points where there are some times where women on the show are wearing a little less than clothes on. So recently, at some points, you'll kind of see things, but not to a point of just like, oh yeah, I get to see all the glory. Weirdly enough, this thing is rated TVMA, so you would think that they would gone any number of ways because it's TVMA. It's so it doesn't really matter. Um, if anyways, in the very beginning of this show, we ultimately have to where people in a very Langoliers like way. I don't know why I keep talking about that Stephen King like show. Ultimately, because I felt like I've talked about that before in some other review. Recently, we have it to where it seems that at some point these people are just kind of going throughout their normal day, and then all of a sudden, every single person on the planet is gone, but them. It seems like there is a skewed multiverse or a skewed like I recently just saw the show The Society, and this kind of feels like that a little bit. But ultimately, it's not just a bunch of young fledgling people. Like it could be an old man, or it could be a middle aged man, or it could be any number of people. It just kind of randomly picks people to be separated from the world in their own alternate world that they would ultimately seemingly be very familiar with. So it seems throughout this game, we ultimately would say that after these people win, they win a visa, which ultimately I'm like, okay, well, shouldn't they have bought a real substantial resource to be able to fight every single one of these levels? Uh, but I'm also thinking, why wouldn't they loot like crazy? Because if any resource is at hand for them to use, which I feel like it is, you would think that they would like get some substantial stuff like shotguns and guns, and like you would think they would just go all crazy and just like buy bulletproof vests, and like you would have thought that they would have reasonably done like got some substantial equipment. Even like an axe to me would be like the most substantial thing to wield. But ultimately, I guess we just have to appeal to the like, oh no, we can't just have a guy roaming around with an axe. Oh no, what's gonna happen if that happens? Dude, have you seen any Walking Dead shows where you got guys walking around all the time with crossbows and guns and Rick Grimes is a sheriff and this and that? Like, dude, you can have that, but you can't. I guess this is what it is, but there's some mind games always playing within these episodes. There's stuff that I really enjoy about these levels, and there's a thinking man's game of everything that is going on to where ultimately we have things that crazily just get loose in the game, or we have things that ultimately lead to a lot of people's deaths, a lot of people that we barely know, but it's like, oh, okay, it's okay if that person goes because like I didn't really care for that person. If he dies, meh, whatever. It's like there's some people that seemingly ultimately have to be athletic as crap in this show as well. It seems like there is some running going on in some episodes, which I'm like, man, there's an entire episode just about like people running, basically. It's like, oh, well, I'm going to run here, but then wait a minute, I'm going to run all the way back here, and then wait a minute, I'm also going to run here as well. But wait, there's more running. It's like, good God, Jeepers Creepers, Batman. Do you think you've run enough in this episode? Like, couldn't you have like edited this a little bit down, a little bit more to just kind of like skip past a lot of this running stuff and just kind of like I don't know, they could actually show these people in between the rounds, in between the levels, to ultimately have them like do something like that is character building or something where you get some levity in the situation where ultimately you have uh like these people dating during these rounds because they're like F it, we're gonna probably die tomorrow, so why don't we just like go on a date or just have some fun or do something. Like there needs to be some downtime in between these rounds that actually help us like the characters, or otherwise we're just going to invest in nobody. And ultimately just realize that probably the main character that we will grow to love will probably die like in episode 8, and then we'll just be like, oh no, this sucks. I was hoping he was gonna win after all this, which I never think anyone will win. What I think will happen is we're gonna have it to be, I think in my mind, the people that seem to be doing really well in this game are ultimately going to be the people that are going to be turning on other gamers. So it's almost going to be like, oh, hey, isn't it great that you were successful at this game? Well, yeah, but you're still going to be in this game still. If anything, you're just going to be the lackey for whoever created this game, which I'm sure we'll never get to. Because reasonably, I don't think that is going to be like I think it's going to be Gantz. Like we never know why that this is a game, but it just is, and like it's not going to be some alien force. It's not going to be some like we're not going to probably find out that it's some military operative, and something like that. But I'm assuming we're never really going to get to know, and I honestly don't really care because ultimately it's reasonably, I just don't think that they're ever going to come to that conclusion. But if they did, I thought that'd be stupid. Because probably whatever they come up with, I'm like, God, that is the stupidest thing. But ultimately, I didn't understand the whole Battle Royale thing either. I didn't understand that whole scenario about how they, like, basically had just a military force come into this classroom and just say, hey, yeah, all you kids, all you detention delinquent kids, yeah, just go and start just killing one another. That makes sense, right? But anyways, so like you would have thought that they would have tried to give these people like a special thing that they could use during the levels. Like it seems like some people adapted. Like you have the one kid that had like a taser. You have like one guy who bought a knife because he's like, well, what if we get to a zombie apocalypse? So anyways, it is time to otherwise go into these episodes and talk about them. Reasonably, of course, we have these people not understanding things, but it seems like we have also some attractive characters that are very much going to be like, well, like, hey, like, I'm going to tell you how this is all going to work, but eventually you're going to have to walk through that door, if you know what I mean. So, anyways, let's go out of our way to do that double five to otherwise spoil this show, because it's fairly interesting. So, let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this show. So, spoilers now. So, in the very first episode, we are to seemingly have everyone upon this deserted city. Because it seems like we get a tiny little bit of backstory about how, like, our main character, who is Arisu, Arisu. I'm gonna try to pronounce that Arisu. So, and it's probably wrong. It's probably Irisu. I don't know. IMDb sucks. Or reasonably, what is this? Yeah, IMDb. Yeah, that's great. So Arisu ultimately is a character that seems to be with his brother, I believe, and his best friend, and so ultimately it seems that we have these characters that reasonably end up being like normal friends. We have Arisu, who is this guy that is consistently playing video games, and he hasn't been doing anything else. Recently, it seems like his brother has a real job, and ultimately his father is ultimately looking at him. It's like, well, hey, like, why aren't you more like your brother? Like, hey, why don't you do something with your life? Because everybody is like kind of putting him down because he hasn't been doing anything with his life really. So we have these three guys get together: Arisu, his best friend, and ultimately his brother. Ultimately, just kind of like go through the town. Ultimately, just to bump into people here and there, people that they're familiar with, people that they'll probably get to know later on in the show or something like that, or get to know at some point. Anyways, mood thing. So we seem to have this town so busy, so full of life and whatever. All of a sudden, these three guys all go into a bathroom and then come out of the bathroom, and this entire town is bizarrely now deserted. And all three of these guys can't figure out why. It seems like they spend an entire day in the middle of this town square. At some points, yeah, they end up. At some points, they end up reasonably going into some parts of the town to ultimately go to their businesses or ultimately go to their homes to ultimately see if anyone's there, which of course they are not. And so we ultimately find out Risu's best friend ultimately gets into a bar fight. So ultimately, we're just naturally assuming that this guy is a hothead, or reasonably is a guy who at least can handle himself in quasi fight at some point. But anyways, we eventually have it to where these three are all just kind of like, like what's gonna happen? Like, why is this town deserted? And so they're like screaming and shouting and like, who cares? Like, there's no law here. So eventually, upon this building, we have this huge white light that appears upon this building, and then ultimately, this building says the game will begin here shortly. So reasonably, the guys are like, okay, I have no clue what that means. So ultimately, they just head to a big flashing pink light where ultimately they all walk to. They ultimately walk into this environment, which ultimately they could have done nothing, but ultimately they didn't. But reasonably, they head down. They head downtown to ultimately go into this building that ultimately scans them all in and they just don't quite understand what is going on. Every single time within these levels, there seems to be cell phones for all these people to take, one per person. Ultimately, every single time that they get these cell phones, they get like scanned to ultimately say that this is them. So I thought that this was really cool. I thought that was really awesome that like people like grab these phones at random and they can kind of tell who they are. So ultimately, we have it to where we have this one girl that comes in to be with these three boys. Ultimately, she is, I believe, Usagi, Usage, Usagi. I'm assuming. Uh, Yuzuya, Yuzuya Usagi. Hopefully that's pronounced right. Ultimately, she ends up coming into having previous knowledge of this game. Ultimately, to tell the guys to otherwise say, like, yeah, you guys are going to have to come into this room eventually and start playing this game or you're going to die. So, of course, we have all three of these guys who are basically following her because it seems like she knows what she's doing and they have no clue. Every single one of these rounds, you are, of course, going to either going to get a brand new person or you're probably going to get a very experienced person that has probably done this numerous times and, again, still doesn't know that they should probably hold a gun to them or ultimately have any number of things with them. They just kind of just walk in here just all happy-go-lucky like, yeah, I've done this like 4 times already. Isn't it great? And I have no weapon on my person, but I guess if anything, if I just die, I die. Whatever. It's like, God, these people are stupid. Stupid people. Why do you do this? So, because ultimately, I guess they just deem their lives meaningless. So I guess if they end up getting shot up or get killed or whatever, I guess it doesn't matter, right? So ultimately, the very first game we find out ultimately has a door that has to be picked that is going into a life or death scenario. We ultimately have Asuri, who ultimately seemed to have seemingly noticed a lot of things that stood out, looking at a map of the building, looking at a car that was outside, looking at numerous things of the building, and so on and so forth before he came in here. And so reasonably we have it to where at first people are like guessing which door to go into and taking a heavily severely long time. We ultimately have some girl who, of course, for any number of these girls in the show are all really attractive, of course, because why wouldn't they be? So we have one girl who is also with Usagi, who wasn't actually her friend or anything. It was just some random person that showed up. She ultimately picks the. She ultimately picks the. She ultimately picks a door that leads to her death. And so reasonably, it seems like they ultimately otherwise decide to pick the other door because it seems like they're running out of time. It seems like gas is coming from the ground to ultimately let them know that they should go soon, or otherwise they are going to be dead. So every single time they tend to go through these doors, ultimately they have to do it in lesser and lesser time, pick a door, and ultimately hope that you're going to win, or otherwise you're going to end up dead because this whole entire room is going to light up with fire. So you need to decide what door you're going to use. So ultimately we find out a Rusi main character. We ultimately find that the main character who I've been talking about this entire time, which is a lot easier to say than the actual name, butchering it every single time. We ultimately figure out that this guy is good with puzzles, and then ultimately is trying to figure out that ultimately they need to have a plan of attack for all this besides just guessing whether it's alive or dead or not. And so recently it seems that Asuru Risu ultimately figures out that, okay, there's a pattern to the map that was on the thing that I saw for like seconds. And so reasonably there is a reason to get around this whole puzzle. So eventually he is like, oh, okay, we need to pick these doors. Sometimes it's lives, sometimes it's death, sometimes it's lives, sometimes it's death. They go through all these patterns and ultimately they realize, like, okay, well, shouldn't there be a door to get out of here? And there isn't one. And so reasonably we have it to where they have to have been bizarrely, like, at the very beginning of this, pulling out their phones to luckily be able to video record this. To ultimately, luckily, at this perfect time, they had watched this girl go through this one room that had no door. So reasonably, that easily helped them decide where the exit is and which door to pick. And so reasonably, they end up going through these whole trick doors. So we ultimately have the main character, his brother, and his best friend, and this girl. And so we eventually get to know every single one of these people's like we eventually get to know Usagi's backstory as well. Basically, she told them that supposedly she had been in a conference meeting, which is bullshit. What actually she was doing is sleeping with her boss to get a higher position, and ultimately that's what she had done a lot, because ultimately she had slept her way to the top. And so reasonably we find out that our main character's brother ultimately has a crazy wicked scar on his or burn on his leg, that ultimately is going to seemingly have him not be able to do much of anything, and it hurts so badly to where ultimately they can't, I guess, figure out how to treat this wound or anything like that because it burns so badly. And ultimately, we have Risu's brother not being able to walk on this, ultimately having it to where Risu and his best friend ultimately go into another match to hope that there's a doctor there, and Usagi and Risu's brother ultimately stay to ultimately for her to try to seduce him as well, to ultimately think that maybe she can possibly use him to win this game. Because in her mind, she needs to go back to her life, she needs to go back to her banking job that ultimately she slept her way into getting. And so now that that is taken from her clutches, she ultimately wants to do whatever she can to win this game, because ultimately she is wanting to go back to that job that she worked her way back up to get. But ultimately, she just uses her feminine wilds um, to ultimately kind of think that she can use people, which is kind of sad. But this character is who she is. We ultimately also find some old man. When they exit this game, they also find some old man who decides that he otherwise wants to quit and or forfeit the game and no longer wants to play. Immediately, every single time that someone dies or someone quits, there is a laser that comes from out of the sky through this person's head and kills them, which I thought was an interesting thing to do. And it seems like at some point you get this visual, especially if somebody like looking out like upon this big huge scenery piece, like out in the open somewhere, where ultimately you see just a bunch of lasers all coming from the ground or coming from the sky just to kill people. I was like, wow, that is a very interesting visual, and that's very intricate, but it's probably just a bunch of random digital lasers all coming down wherever. It doesn't matter where it is, but I think it's still a cool looking visual, anyways. So we have to where again the Asuri and his best friend are ultimately pushed to going into another game because they're hoping that they can find some doctor there. But it seems like whenever they talk to any of these people, like, "Hey, are any of you a doctor?" They're like, "No." We seemingly have one person who is a real estate guy, ultimately justifyingly telling us how this game technically works, how like the shovels or the clubs or the clovers or the diamonds or the hearts all work. But to me, that was still a little bit confusing. There's some matches where supposedly, I guess, they're very physical or they're very endurance driven, or but ultimately, supposedly, the hearts are the worst levels. So if you get a heart level, people are just like, "Oh no, this is the worst one. Everyone's probably gonna die, or probably everyone's not gonna make it out of this one." So this wasn't a heart level yet, but we'll get there. So we have it to where seemingly in this level, this match was called hide and seek. So some of these have like some kind of bizarrish like old fashioned like themes, and like ultimately the very first game was Dead or Alive, uh, and this game was called Hide and Seek. So we have it to where it seems that we have a person with a horse's costumed mask on, and they ultimately have an SMG or like a an Uzi of sorts. Um, and this person is the person who is it in hide and seek. And so now we have to have a bunch of people who are all not these people or this person with this horse head on, having to run all over the place, because ultimately they need to find one room that has a secret in it that ultimately stops this game. So recently, at first, we also find some guys within this group. It seems like one guy is wearing like seemingly military like fatigues of sorts, so I'm assuming he has some combat training. It seems like there's some other guy there that seems to be his friend, but ultimately we're not really sure exactly what his like if like what's gonna happen to him or not. We also have seemingly a girl that is a rock climber, and she will get her own story. But I'm like, man, so this girl can like parkour, and she's a rock climber, and I'm like, God, I'm really impressed in this with this girl. I hope, if anything, I hope she lasts like the entire show, um, because she was really impressing me. We also had this guy seemingly in a white hoodie with white hair, who just was kind of like a looky loo, who was trying to get like the best vantage point to just see the entire game. For him, he wasn't really trying to do much of anything until he feels that ultimately he's like, well, I guess I figured things out now, so I guess I will then finally be a part of this game. Which I'm like, God, what a douchebag. But so, anyways, there's also another brand new person that is like, he is the most cowardice person on the planet, to the point to where even Arisu has to go and like save him from being shot at, because this kid just like stands still and doesn't do anything. So we eventually have it to where within here that eventually the horse headed Uzi shooting person seemingly is just going around and just killing a lot of people. There's some people trying to leave the game and they get killed by doing that. We have we have it to where this horse head keeps going around, and ultimately, we have the guy with the military fatigues that is ultimately having this master plan of like, dude, we gotta take this guy who's it. We gotta take him out. Like, if anything, like we'll just kind of catch him when he's reloading. So recently we get Suri and his best friend with Suri's best friend with a fire extinguisher, and this guy with military fatigues with fire extinguisher, and then we have the guy with the fatigues best friend ultimately being basically a decoy and or pawn, because once this horse-headed person comes to him and is going to kill him, ultimately it's like, hey guys, anytime now, anytime now, and ultimately this guy is left to be shut up, and it's like, oh man, like yeah, like nobody cares about anybody. If ultimately somebody wants you dead, you're gonna die. Sorry. But ultimately that's when they try to catch this guy reloading, and that's when they try to shoot him with fire extinguishers. Ultimately, we have to where they ultimately knock the gun out of his hands. Ultimately, for this guy with the horse's head to just shell out a machete. I'm like, F God, like these most of these people seemingly have barely next to nothing. If anything, Suri's best friend ultimately had that knife because ultimately he got that from the store for a zombie apocalypse, but reasonably, like he was stabbing this guy and like nothing was happening. So reasonably, that like whole knife thing was like kind of rendered moot because that knife really didn't do much of anything. But this guy didn't really stab this guy with the horse's head in the head, anyways. So we have it to where this guy seems to have some real tactical prowess, to where even the guy in the fatigues is getting freaking just clocked by this guy. It seems like whoever they pick for these games, like man, or whatever these things are, like they are real, genuine threats. Like, don't mess with any of these things because you will not win. Most of the time, you will die. So justifiably, like, try to stay your way out of it. Or if you're going to fight this person, realize or hope that it's a fight that you actually can win, or otherwise just get out of its way. So going into here, we have it to where the guy with the fatigues eventually gets the guy with the machete, but we have Suri's best friend who ultimately gets a cut for his trouble in his chest. So really, none of these people are doctors. So reasonably, if anything, like we have a Suri who eventually, or Suri's best friend who eventually just gets just a chest bandage after this, which ultimately I'm like, dude, that's not really gonna do much of anything. Like if this thing is really opened up, like somebody needs to learn to sew or something. But anyway, so we go along here and we have it to where this guy in fatigues is just consistently punching this horse's head just repeatedly in the head over and over and over because like this guy is just not seemingly ever going down. Ultimately, the guy with the machete ultimately like cut this guy in the eye, so he's like, oh, so this is how this is gonna go now. So reasonably, we get it to where we have it to where eventually the guy with the white hair and white hoodie finally does freaking something. Like, Suri is shouting out, it's like, hey, if you see the guy with the horse's head, it's like, let us know which floor he's on so that way we can get away from him. It seems like he is rallying people around him. It seems like the girl who is the parkour girl ultimately is kind of just jumping from floor to floor to floor to where she can completely avoid this guy, which I thought was crazy. To ultimately just be like, okay, how is she going to go up from floors and this and that? But recently, she is looking through floors trying to find where this special door is, while everybody else is scrambling around just consistently dying. Ultimately, we have it to where this girl is like monkey girl. She can even climb on pipes and all kinds of craziness. So, anyways, we eventually have it to where it seems the guy with the white hoodie and Asuri eventually know where exactly the key door was. Because it seems that the horse's head guy was shooting at somebody from across uh, where he was. So ultimately, Suri was like, why did the horse's head guy change directions to ultimately shoot at this door specifically? This makes no sense. And so recently you have it to where both the guy with the white hoodie and Asori made the consensus of the reason why this guy was shooting at this door is because that was a secret door. So we have it to where they both go through this door and they realize there's another person with another horse head that ultimately has a Uzi in here. To ultimately find the guy with the white hoodie had and white hair ultimately has a taser. Like, wow, this could have been used like 20 minutes ago for any number of these people with these guns. But yeah, so this guy had a taser to take down this other horse-headed person, but this horse-headed person is just gonna keep getting right back up consistently to where this character cannot freaking go down. We have it to where they make it to this special room where they have to have two people hit these two buttons simultaneously, and Asuri is yelling like, "Hey, can anybody get to this room? Like, please help me. I need another person to hit this other toggle. Like, come on, somebody get here." And so eventually we have the horse's head person come into this room, and ultimately we're consistently having a battle with Asuri and this gun person to get to knock this gun out of this person's hand and ultimately to try to figure out how to kill this person. But so eventually they incapacitate this horse-headed thing again with the taser yet again, and then ultimately we have simultaneously the girl that ultimately can parkour jumps into the room and dodges all the bullets to ultimately jump to simultaneously with the Suri to hit these buttons to stop this game. Ultimately, to kill this person with the donkey head, because we find out that this person with the donkey head being unmasked is a woman that ultimately has this collar on. That ultimately, when the game is done, her head explodes basically, and ultimately she had a phone on her that said "Game Over." So I'm like, wait a minute. So either a lot of people were forcibly playing as a villain in this game, or ultimately were playing to save their own skins. But ultimately, I'm like, there's something more than this. Like, so after people maybe win so many rounds, maybe they turn into villains. I don't know. But yeah, it's eventually at some point I'm gonna probably figure that out. That eventually towards the end of this, maybe Asuri is just gonna eventually just become uh, a a cog in this machine to ultimately do what people tell them to do and ultimately become villains at some point. So pushing on, we ultimately have none of these people that come from this game to come with uh, Asuri and his best friend. But eventually we'll get to see these people a little bit later. So reasonably, we end up having it to be that Asagi and Arisu, Arisu's brother, ultimately are going to have their visas expire soon. And so ultimately now Arisu and his best friend ultimately couldn't figure out if there was a doctor or figure out how to fix this guy's leg or whatever. So they're just like, well, we just have to play this game. There's nothing we can do. Excuse me. But you're going to see a lot of times throughout this show that people are going to get hurt a lot. People are going to have to figure out how to work around their injuries a lot. So we ultimately have within the next episode that we now have uh, Risu, his best friend, his brother, and still this hot woman, this hot chick that ultimately had to sleep her way to get her position that she wanted to ultimately be left to death with this game. So now we have to have it to where now we have seemingly this other quasi hide and seek like game, but it's kind of with foxes and lambs. And so now we have to have people have these like collar esh like things on with also this like headgear device that ultimately is attached through the back of the neck of like spine and such and sorts. So reasonably, this game is of course having a level of hearts. So it's like, oh crap, this is the worst game, and ultimately it's a heart level I think at like 4 or something like that. So reasonably, either way, usually the heart games are the worst. I'm assuming probably on the very last episode we're probably gonna have a heart level that is like everyone's just going to have to die. Probably is what's gonna happen at the very end, and so everyone's just gonna have to go out and die, I guess. So because I'm assuming our main character that we've had for the longest time is going to die seemingly soon. So ultimately, I was thinking, I'm like, oh my god, don't tell me every single one of these people are all going to die right here, right now, and then I'm gonna have to reinvest in a random group of people because that's at some point what they do with Gantz. They kind of make it to where it's like, oh yeah, just any of these people that you'll invest in, well, F them. Like, they're all gonna die, F them, because they were dead anyways, so, sucks to be them. Um, and I assumed that this was going to end that way, so I'm like, oh, okay, I can't invest in anybody. So, going into here, within this level where all 4 of these people have to basically go against one another. F if they're best friends, F if they're brothers, F if they're romantically entangled in with anyone. So here's how the game goes. We have 4 people that all have to just look at one another. Once they look at one another, once they lock eyes, justifiably, that is supposedly the fox finding the lambs. And to ultimately whoever become like supposedly at first the way they break this down is that the lambs have to hide from the fox, but actually it's actually reverse because the fox is the one that is going to win this game and the lambs are going to be the ones that are all going to die. So reasonably whoever looks into the eyes of anyone and becomes the fox, ultimately if they can get away from everyone else, then they can live to the next level. So reasonably at first, of course, Usagi is ultimately trying to, of course, be the fox, and she's ultimately trying to ultimately just go like, well, F it now. Like, I don't have to be nice to any of these people. So reasonably what ends up happening is she ends up trying to be, of course, the fox and running away, but that's not going to work. Ultimately, we kind of switch between a bunch of people to ultimately be the fox, but ultimately Arisu eventually becomes the fox. We ultimately have it to where Arisu's brother ultimately is tackling down Usagi, who ultimately he had slept with her, and ultimately he's kind of mad that she's kind of turning on him now, so quickly after sleeping with him. And so recently, he is like Usagi's brother is holding Risu's brother Usage down, and ultimately just kind of holding her indefinitely, to the point where he's eventually just kind of like grabbing her and dragging her further off to uh, seemingly not be found. Because ultimately, we have it to where Risu ultimately is hiding, and ultimately his best friend is just like, hey, you've betrayed me. Like, how could you do this to me? Because ultimately, Arisu's best friend had gotten the wedding ring for his girlfriend because ultimately he wanted to marry this girl that ultimately he had been with at this bar. And so, reasonably, that was the driving force for him to win whatever this match was, to ultimately eventually finally get to marry this girl to where he's even holding the wedding ring as he's seemingly bleeding out, because his wound evidently is getting worse. His chest wound is getting worse now, even though he put a bandage over it. What good does that do? So we ultimately having it seemingly where Arisu is just like, you know what, I can't handle this kind of pressure of hiding. And so ultimately he's telling everybody, hey, yeah, guys, I'm going to quit. Like, I'm gonna let you guys win, and one of you can win. I don't care who it is, but it's not going to be me. Even though he's the smartest one out of this group, and ultimately everyone knows that. Uh, Ultimately, when he goes out to quit, every single one of his friends and family and whatever, and all these other people, they hide from him. They ultimately choose him to be the winner of this game, and they all die for him. Ultimately, there's 30 seconds left, and uh, Risu's brother and his quasi girlfriend kiss before the time's up, because ultimately uh, they realize they're gonna die anyways. So she kisses him and they hug one another. And I was like, oh, that's kind of nice. And then eventually we have it to where Risu is seeing his best friend right before he dies, and basically his best friend dies right in front of him, blasts with blood right in his face, and he's like, "Oh my god, I just watched my best friend die." Because justifiably, we have it to where these friends or these people are just kind of remembering old stories. They're talking about the good times and stuff like that because they know they're gonna die. So reasonably, they're just like, hey, how about we just talk about the one time that that we smoked a cigarette together, or we were having fun together and this and that, and just realizing they're gonna die, and so reasonably they don't want to like they want to just remember the good times. They want to remember the fun that they had before they got here, and so I thought that that was really nice. So we have it to where Risu ultimately notices or realizes that every single one of his friends are dead, and ultimately he wins this thing. But it's kind of a bittersweet win ultimately for him to just be laying somewhere in the middle of the street, ultimately just feeling defeated, and he's like, I just want to die. Like, I just want to die now. Like, recently I'm like I've lost I've lost my best friend, I've lost my brother, I've lost everything, and like I'm just gonna end up dead anyways. I had to go through all that heartache, all that craziness, just to know that probably I'm just gonna die soon. I watch everyone that I love to die, and I'm next. So we now have Arisu, who is just in the middle of the road, just ultimately waiting to die, and we ultimately have the girl who is the rock climber, and or the girl that was the parkour esh like girl, that ultimately she had seen Risu ultimately just kind of just laying about on the street, and she's like, "What are you doing?" It's like, "Are you okay?" And he's like, "Yeah, I'm just waiting to die." So reasonably it gets to the point to where we find out her backstory, that her and her father evidently climbed Mount Everest. Evidently, this father of hers was like the world's best climber, to the point where he didn't need an oxygen tank to climb Mount Everest. And I guess also was his daughter not needing to have a oxygen tank while climbing Mount Everest, and this and that. So we find that seemingly there is some controversy via this mountain climber, and so reasonably we have it to where this girl's father just leaves to go back to the mountain, because he's like, "I feel at peace at the mountain, and ultimately I'm hoping that uh, all this stuff about me will just go away." So reasonably, while this girl is ultimately seeing her father go away, ultimately that's when she sees everything go away, and leading her to be part of this game now. So ultimately we have it to where later on you see this girl who is ultimately making food for herself in some tent. Ultimately we have Risu, who ultimately is in a sleeping bag off to the side. And so, really, she has to push him to get back into this game. Ultimately, telling him that ultimately he had tried to save everyone's life in that game. Ultimately, shouting to everyone to work as a team to ultimately say where this horse-headed person was. That is the reason why she is trying to return the favor now, to keep this guy alive, giving him food, telling him to eat, and ultimately I'm like, man, this part is really awesome, to kind of pick this guy back up and ultimately to say, hey, like, you tried to save me before, so I'm going to save you now. And so now we will be even, and so now we'll just keep trying to save one another for however long that could be. So, man, I thought that was beautiful. I thought that was like amazing part of the show. That was probably the best part of this show, where a guy that was completely crushed and defeated, just sleeping in the middle of the street for hours on end, to ultimately be told, it's like, hey, you tried to save me before, I'm gonna save you. So that was great. That was beautiful. So pushing on to now have these people have their visas being running out soon, and now they have to play yet again another game. Pause here. All right. So now we go into yet another level, yet another match, another round. It seems like this round and or match isn't as hard as a heart, so there's not like an escalation where it's like, okay, well, every level is just gonna progressively be harder. No, it seems like every single level is like a lot of random stuff going on at some points. Some stuff is probably much more challenging than other levels, and this and that. So we have it to where these people need to get all the way to this bus. And that's what starts out the round. So it seems like all the people get upon this bus, and we have it to where we meet three other guys. It seems that one guy is walking around with a limp, and two other guys are ultimately just with him. It seems like they were all winners, so ultimately they kept like teaming up together for every single mission. So supposedly this goal is, or for this mission, Supposedly, we are to assume that this whole mission has something to do with distance. Creating distance is what we were to assume this mission is. So we have it to where once they start at this bus, they naturally have to assume get as far away from the bus as humanly possible. And so really, the guy with the bum leg, because ultimately he tweaked his knee or he tweaked his ankle or whatever. Yeah, he tweaked his ankle because his ankle's wrapped up. Ultimately, this guy is ultimately just going like, "Hey, I'm just gonna stay on the bus. There's nothing I can do. I will just die. If anything, all you guys can just go, and I'll just figure out what's gonna happen for me." So this guy stays on the bus to eventually, I guess, just die. So reasonably, everybody's like, "No, we won't leave you." And he's just like, "Go. Like, if anything, you have kids and everything like that. Just go ahead and go." So reasonably, what ends up happening is they at first think that they can drive the bus somewhere. They think, "Oh, hey, how about we just drive this bus? If anything, this is the one bus that doesn't have like a certain kind of IC chip or some kind of computer chip of sorts." So they think they can drive the bus, but there is no gas in this bus. Coincidentally. So what they end up thinking about doing, because there is something about like computer chips being put into certain items, where certain items can still work but not everything. They find out like a radio can work but not everything. So we have to where seemingly that we have these people all running out, or trying to outrun this bus. From wherever the bus is, they're trying to run like thousands upon thousands of miles away from this bus. Then ultimately, they end up seemingly with a leopard. A leopard just bizarrely comes out of nowhere and starts attacking these people. I'm like, what? I'm so confused. Why is it all of a sudden there's a leopard here? This makes no sense. But yeah, so we have this leopard that ultimately just starts attacking people, and so reasonably they have to figure out strategies to otherwise avoid this leopard. And it seems that 3 out of the 4 people are able to avoid this leopard. We ultimately have one guy seemingly with a weapon that is consistently trying to numerous times over trying to stab this leopard, but this leopard just jumps on him and just starts eating him alive seemingly. So this guy's dead. The guy with the full mustache and beard out of all of everybody. That's the only way to really define this person because he's the only one with real true facial hair besides everyone else. And so you just see this guy getting hauled away by this leopard, and I'm like, oh my god, this is awful. But oh well, this is just some random person that sadly enough you couldn't get to know in long enough. So now we are just having like 3 other people just repetitively just continue to just run and run and run, to the point to where eventually you see Asuri, who ultimately notices that there is some motorcycle that seems to have a that seems to be able to also be able to run compared to every other vehicle here. And so, because this is an older motorcycle that I guess could run. And so that stuck out to Asuri. So basically, what he ends up doing is he thinks that it's like, hey, how about I go back to try to retrieve the guy who had the leg brace, or the foot brace. How about I go back for him to try to get to him and try to hopefully I go back. I'm gonna go back for him and try to save him. So we have it to where ultimately this kid is dragging along this motorcycle now going all of his way, all the way back to this person. He's just dragging this motorcycle along. He's not starting it. He's just dragging it along. And I'm like, oh my god, this is awful. Not only has this guy ran numerous miles, I'm assuming out of his way. Now he's running all the way back with a motorcycle. Now I'm like, good god, this is awful. So we have these two other people that are running continuously. At some point, there were drinks for them to be able to drink, and they were like, "Oh no, I'm not drinking these. There's they're probably poisoned in them. They're probably gonna kill us." And so reasonably, they end up. Luckily, the girl who was the mountain climber, she had like her spare thing of water where everyone freaking shared. I don't quite understand how exactly there was so much water in that for all of those people to considering how much they drank. But like, dude, you could have saved it for the round trip there, buddy. Take sips. Don't gobble the whole thing down. You crazy? Like that whole container felt like enough for one person. Was there endless amount of water coming out of that thing? No, there wasn't. Anyways, so we have it to where because people they weren't going to test the they weren't going to test that water because they thought that it was a trap or they thought it was poison. It seems like someone was going to try it, but ultimately he like shoved it out of his hand, and towards me, then the other two came in there and like, well, hey, you're not drinking it, like so you're just waiting to see if we'll drink it. It's like, yeah, because if you die, then I'll know if it's poison or not. So nobody drank it, and she had luckily a spare thing of water. Luckily, so pushing us on to have these two people, like one guy really ran out of gas, but they're just continuously running anyways, to the very end of this bridge or this like tunnel. So they ultimately think that the very end of this tunnel is the goal, and they're like, oh, okay, well, we'll just wait for the other people to show. We'll just wait for um, the guy with the bus to show up. And so what we end up finding out is that once these people are waiting uh, seemingly for seemingly for these people to come back for this bus and they don't think that it's going to happen, all of a sudden they start seeing like screws come flying uh, out of this goal that they were supposed to get to. And they're like, hey, like what is up with this? What is up with this like door here? Why is it breaking? And then they're all of a sudden starting to realize that there is water coming out of this doorway. And so they're like, oh crap. Must not be the actual goal. So they then now have to run all the way back the opposite way. I'm like, good God, like this guy was already exhausted. He couldn't run anymore. And now you having to have him run back even further to the point where it seems that this guy just falls and he just gives up. Ultimately, his story was that he had a baby on the way. And so ultimately, he ends up dropping the photo of his wife, ultimately to pick it back up. And as soon as he like picks that back up, that's when this huge batch of water all comes in and swooshes him and basically probably kills him. So we now have this girl that has been running forever and is the mountain rock climber and whichever one have you. She's now running as crazily as possible to the opposite way of which she has to run now. All while the guy on the bus with the injured guy ultimately is driving that same way and now is ultimately trying to retrieve the rock climbing girl. The Asuri is kind of out the door of this bus to ultimately grab onto the girl to hope that they can close this bus door and kind of just maybe seal themselves in this bus, ultimately hoping that they can kind of get through this water. So what ends up happening is this bus ends up like turning and ends up having to forcibly flip over with all the power of this water. And so we have it to where this bus flips over, the water goes gushing all the way through this entire place. And so we end up having it to where seemingly all the people on the bus are perfectly okay. It's like, oh, thank God. So here is the trick. Here is what we ended up finding out, that this bus was safe all along. Their point was to be able to find a goal. And bizarrely, when they ended up getting on the bus, they didn't realize that goal was slapped on the side of the bus and they didn't even realize it the entire time. So the whole distance thing was actually the distance away from the bus. They were actually supposed to be on the bus the entire time. The distance 0 was actually supposed to mean that they were safe the entire time, but instead they went out and they ran and wasted so much energy doing so to ultimately just almost get killed, or so many people got wastefully killed, and they could have been safe the entire time on this bus, which is heartbreaking. And so ultimately, reasonably, they didn't even need the gas. They could have just been safe on the bus. They could have been safe on the bus. And so reasonably, the guy with the injury was like, "Oh my God, I was safe the entire time. I could have won this entire time just by staying on the bus." And they're like, "Yeah, like you you were smarter than all of us were." And so recently, because they realized on the very side of the bus it said the word goal slapped on the side of the bus, so they're like, "Oh my God, like we were dumb." We were dumb, we were stupid. We didn't realize, like, that's the thing, like, people are observant, but like this is like observant to a absurd degree. Like this is like, I like, that's the thing that I hate about mind games, or that's what I hate about uh, trick games and stuff like that, where it takes you hours upon hours to figure out, or a lot of times you have to forcibly try to watch someone else who had figured it out, and then like, oh, okay, I'll do the same thing. That's the thing that I hate about like games that have tricks to them or whatever. It's like, man, I hate these like riddle or puzzle like games where ultimately it makes me just look stupid, and then I'm like a schmuck that ultimately is just like, meh, well, I couldn't figure this out. But anyways, so reasonably, that's just how this episode tends to end, with them just kind of reluctantly thinking that like, wow, we won this level. Luckily, if we went on this bus and that was our game plan all along, to keep the bus with us or figure out how to use this bus to have gasoline in it. And yeah, so luckily they kept going with this bus. They could have probably used the motorcycle and got themselves out of there, or figured out some other master plan or whatever to figure this out, but ultimately they just decided to use the bus, luckily, to win this level. Eventually, I'm assuming we're gonna lead further down into death. I'm sure we're probably gonna lose probably our main focal point of character that we've had. He's probably going to die. I am assessing that this character is going to die, right? Like, he's probably going to die probably within either the last episode or before that. Probably at an like, it'll probably be one of those where it probably won't be obvious to like, oh yeah, he's just going to die on episode 5 or episode 7, right before the last episode, and then you have to invest in other people. But ultimately, I'm assuming that the levels are going to get much more harder, and reasonably it'll be interesting to eventually see these people eventually die. Uh, Especially if you've invested in any number of them, and eventually when we'll probably get more heart levels, which I'm sure those are coming. It seems like we haven't really gotten a huge variety of different kinds of levels. It reasonably just comes down to, okay, well, here's a four of clubs, or here's a three of clovers, or oh, here's a four of hearts, or oh, here's a four of this, or oh, here's a three of that. Yeah, like, so reasonably, like, you don't get to see like a ton of rounds, and you also don't see a ton of different drastic changes of levels. So that kind of sucks. Um, but I guess it like, well, we don't make these levels too hard because ultimately we want to make sure that some people could quite possibly easily get these out of live. And reasonably, I think there's some levels that are harder than others, and so reasonably, I don't think all of them should be three or fours. I think some of them should honestly be like sixes or sevens, but it ends up being the way it is. So I'm gonna get out of here. I ultimately like this show. I thought it was really fun, and I like the whole trickery of it because ultimately makes you think like, oh, I have to be really observant throughout these episodes, or rewatch. Like it probably has some rewatchability to it as well, which I think is fun. So, anyways, I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.